In the year 2020, I started a podcast about movies. Some episodes occasionally focused on other media as well. As I dealt with threatening interdimensional beings, I eventually met my other self from another universe where all the stuff I talked about got delayed. As it turns out, the stories as me and my guests described them were presented very differently in that other universe. So I continued podcasting these recaps, which apparently sound like improvised reviews, to entertain listeners of that other universe while they waited for the new release dates. Some episodes even focused on content of years past that did not come out in that other universe for whatever reason. The year is 2022. The podcast is now bi-weekly, unless stated otherwise. My name is Steven Shinder, and you're listening to Delayed Replay. Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Delayed Replay, that podcast where we usually talk about movies that got delayed in that other universe but came out on time in our universe. But occasionally, like on this episode, we talk about movies that came out in our universe but not in that other universe, apparently. I'm your host, Steven Shinder, and joining me once again to talk about another Men in Black related thing. And it's very fitting because this episode comes out July 2nd, the 25th anniversary of the 1997 film. It is Jesse Bennett from Question Possible Answer. What's up, my dude?
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me back again so soon, Steven. Really looking forward to discussing another Men in Black based movie with you.
Yeah, it's very based, I guess you could say. Link that term in the show notes, I guess, for anyone who doesn't know what based means. But anyway, so yeah, this one we're talking about now is actually the prequel that came out in like 2008, and it's titled Men in Black Declassified. And I guess in our universe, this is what sort of started a trend of like more prequels coming out. Like I know we got the Star Wars prequels before this, but then in like the late 2000s we got like X-Men Origins Wolverine, and then we also got the Star Trek reboot that year. Even though it's a new timeline, people still like it still deals with like younger looking versions of the characters. And then a couple years later we got X-Men First Class, The Thing prequel, Prometheus. So I guess filmmakers were like hearing that this was in development and thinking, this sounds like a neat idea, and sort of did all this other stuff. What do you think of this decision that they made, like going from Frank the Pug to doing this Men in Black Declassified prequel?
So at first I was kind of worried that, with it seems like with like a lot of franchises, if something gets successful, they'll overdo it and run it into the ground. So I was kind of worried that that was going to be happening with this, and I was glad to be proven wrong.
I was 13 or 14 when this was coming out, and I remember at the time I thought the title was funny because it reminded me of the Nickelodeon show Ned's Declassified School Survival Guide. But yeah, when I eventually saw it, I was like, that's interesting, like that this came out around these other prequels. And like thankfully it wasn't X-Men Origins Wolverine quality, but I guess we'll get into some of those plot points in just a bit. But yeah, it kind of hits some of the beats that some prequels do in the beginning, which is like start with a summary of like historical things. Like it begins with this montage of like alien related Earth history events. Like there's like a little scene of people listening to that War of the Worlds radio thing in like the 30s and being scared or whatever. And then there's like a skip to like the Roswell incident, and then we get to like the 1950s when the Men in Black is actually being founded while the space race is going on. So what did you think of this opening montage?
I loved it. Just so, like you said, they start with like the War of the Worlds radio thing, and I wasn't expecting them to include something like that. I was expecting Roswell for sure, but I wasn't expecting the radio show, and it seemed like it played a much higher part in the movie than I was expecting it to be. I was thinking it was just going to be a subtle nod, and yeah, I really loved the intro and everything. It seemed a little bit different than how the other MIB movies come into it, and I loved it for that.
Yeah, it kind of sets the tone. Agent K's story goes through different years, and so I guess this sort of prepared us for like how this story isn't just going to be contained to just one year or 1 week or whatever like we're used to with like the other Men in Black movies before this one. So I quite liked the pace of this, and they do the like cutesy thing of having the War of the Worlds thing being like black and white to sort of emulate the whole old timey sci-fi movie thing. And then once it gets to like with Roswell, they kind of make it look a bit better. Like it kind of goes from like Wizard of Oz black and white to Universal monster movies black and white. I don't know if it felt like that to you, but that's kind of the comparisons that I was getting. And then it got to like the 1950s and sort of like was finally in color and kind of looked like Back to the Future to me, because of course like that movie was in the 50s, so that's my main frame of reference, I guess you could say.
So with the black and white stuff, at first I was wondering, why are they doing this in black and white? And then as it slowly progresses, like, oh, this part of the story was in that time frame, so they want to try to maintain some sense of realism in this extraterrestrial movie, and it slowly progresses to color. And I thought it was an amazing decision on their part.
It's like a fun homage thing. They didn't go too overboard with it. When they're in the 50s, like what'd you think of how they handled like the way that the Men in Black was being formed, like the organization, and how they're like talking about the space race and all that stuff?
It was interesting because, it starts off with you've got this small group of government officials debating on the space race, and, we join the conversation as it's happening, so we miss some of the important stuff that happens in the beginning of the conversation. So it kind of just starts off with the argument of why do we need an organization for this, and then out of nowhere, the guy throws down the paper and is like, because of this, and it's images of Roswell and this and that, and basically really quickly like, oh yeah, we kind of forgot about that, which who knows how people could forget about Roswell. But it was really interesting and amazing to see that there's like, okay, yeah, so this is why we're doing it, and immediately the argument stops and everyone's on board like, yes, we need this.
That's what editing is for, right? Like if you have these long discussions like with government officials, like realistically it would take a really long time to watch all of it, and that could be like a whole boring movie in and of itself. So like it makes sense that they would edit it this way, and I like that they brought back the whole Roswell thing like right away. And yeah, it is kind of funny how people like kind of forgot about that, but that's like the Men in Black franchise in general, right? People just forgetting things.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't know if they had planned on going that way from the beginning, but the neuralizer was basically the technology was brought with Roswell, and I don't know, I just the whole concept of they tie everything in a nice pretty ribbon without really leaving any loose ends to the grand franchise, at least in these early scenes, which was amazing.
Yeah, for sure. And so we get like this whole montage of like, they get their headquarters and it's kind of run down, doesn't look very great. And it's like kind of funny, like thinking of the contrast of how it looks pretty basic here. And we know that eventually it's going to be like a much bigger and more like better looking headquarters. Like, what'd you think of the overall look of this?
I liked it, mainly because you don't expect a new facility to be, well, I guess you do expect a new facility to be perfect, but whenever they don't have quite the funding, it makes sense for them to be starting from the bottom and kind of climbing the tiers to where they get to where we see in like Men in Black 1 and Men in Black 2. And so it was really nice to see, well, of course it's not going to be perfect. We don't have the licenses that are going to return a profit for us to make our upgrades yet.
The actors that they got for this scene were quite good, I think. Like, what were like some of the performances that stood out to you?
The main one that really stood out was Jim Parsons being like one of the head government officials.
Yeah.
And it was just amazing that, to see someone of that caliber in a role that he was, I don't even know what his role was. I just know he was a government official, and it, for those that don't know, Jim Parsons is Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory. And it was nice to see him be in a role that wasn't Sheldon Cooper. The way that he brought his emotions to that role, even though it's hard to explain, but I mean, yeah, Jim Parsons being in that role was amazing, and I don't think they could have found anyone better for the government official.
Yeah, because in the Big Bang Theory, Sheldon would get on my nerves, but here he dials some of that back, but still feels very authoritative, like he's a man in charge, a man in a leadership position. And it was a different performance. I would even go as far as to say it's one of his best, if not his best. Another role of his I kind of like is in that Muppets movie during that song Muppet of a Man.
I don't think I've seen that Muppets movie.
Yeah, it's the one with Jason Segel and Amy Adams. I think that came out in like 2011 or something. But
Okay.
yeah, I liked it, but apparently Frank Oz didn't like it, or the Office like TV show that came later, which is funny because I liked those movies and that TV show. But I don't know, maybe sometimes I just like the things that kind of go against the grain of what their franchise is, which is why I love Scooby Doo Mystery Incorporated or the Looney Tunes show from like the early 2010s. But anyway, this movie, I guess that kind of relates how like Men in Black Declassified does go against the grain, like not in a Frank the Pug sort of way where it just focuses on the mascot, but in a way where it's like, it's showing us these different time periods and these characters we're not so used to until Agent K comes into the picture. Like it really, it's kind of a shock to the system at first, but it's a good shock if that makes any sense. Like you're just kind of thrown in, and it's like, okay, let's redefine what the Men in Black world is from this point on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Just
Yeah.
like like you were saying, the going against the grain, but not really, because like with Frank the Pug, we see what was it? It was like the 60s and all of this, and it was kind of all over the place against the grain, whereas this one was more contained, linear progression. And I just thought that was amazing.
Yeah, like it's not a Quentin Tarantino movie where it goes all out of order. They progress through the 50s, and we every now and then it cuts to like the footage of like news coverage of stuff like Sputnik and all these other things. And we get like some music set to this montage where they're continuously like working in the headquarters, and they keep on renovating and making it look better, and got some like Elvis Presley music in the background, kind of to remind us of like where we are. But yeah, like I don't know like how much Elvis you're familiar with, but what did you think of that music choice here?
So I mean, obviously I'm familiar with Elvis as an artist and everything, but I never really listened to any of his music. I was born really late 80s, might as well have been 90s. So like, I've listened to some older music, but I never really listened to Elvis. I'm aware of his contributions to the music industry and everything, but it was just never, I guess, my cup of tea, I guess you could say.
Right. I'm pretty much only familiar with what I've heard in the Lilo and Stitch franchise. I guess a little bit of Forrest Gump. There was like a bit of him in that as well. And that's pretty much the extent of my Elvis knowledge. But even being unfamiliar with his catalog, it did sound to my ears that they weren't just playing one song, they were skipping through like it was kind of like you have these songs on a compilation and you put it on the like the player and it's like skipping to a different track after it's like midway through one of them. So it was kind of annoying to me how noticeable it was. But I thought Elvis was a fine choice for this montage, even if I'm not that super tuned in to him as like since I'm not so familiar with his catalog, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm an Elvis fan, but I am familiar with his like I do like what I've heard from him, and I like how like I do acknowledge that he was so influential on like many other artists, like the Beatles included, and they influenced some of my favorite artists. So
And something I just now kind of realized thinking about it now is like, of course they choose Elvis because, there's always been the fan theories out there that Elvis was an alien. And then in the first Men in Black movie, uh, they're like, don't you know Elvis is dead? He's like, no, he just went home. So of course they're going to include this artist who is rumored to be an alien.
oh yeah, that's a really good point. So it progresses to March of 1961, and here we have the introduction of Kevin Brown, the future Agent K himself. And of course, he's played by Josh Brolin, whom they later get back for Men in Black 3. And you can tell that they tried making him look younger than he actually was, but I'm not sure how effective it was. But I don't know. What did you think of the makeup that they used for him?
I enjoyed it. I mean, this was one of the earlier attempts that movies had made at de-aging. So of course it's not going to be perfect at all. And so like, you can kind of see the makeup lines on the neck where they try to blend everything, but at the same time they weren't trying to de-age him 50 years or anything like that. I want to say they only had to de-age maybe 15 years or something like that, and I could be wrong on those estimates also. But so overall, I thought they did pretty good. It didn't ruin the performance for me at all.
Yeah, and I did wonder whether they tried a little bit of CGI to smooth things out, but if they did, they didn't go overboard like they do with some of these other things in this, like in some other prequel things, I guess. And the introduction was kind of different from what I expect from the character. It felt very American Graffiti, like he's basically racing in his car with some buddies, and it's like, wow, Kevin, like future Agent K is like actually really wild in his early 20s.
I wasn't expecting that because, I mean, throughout the rest of the series, he's a very, I guess, stern would be the right term to use for how he is in the rest of the series. And before he's an agent, he is very carefree in what he does.
Yeah, because by the time we see him, like the younger him in 1969, he does seem very stoic and by the books. But here he's like very, this is the start of the 60s, or I guess the second year of the 60s, and he's very carefree and very full of joy and life and very passionate in like his relationship with the woman that he loves, and to the point where like he'll like surprise her with this picnic and they'll have like a really lively discussion and he'll be like serenading to her, and it's like, whoa, this is not the Agent K I was expecting.
Yeah, and like just going off with that relationship and everything, it's like they don't really define because in the movies, in the first one at least, there's the scene in that one where he's using the satellite to zoom in and basically look over this woman to make sure she's okay, and it's all kind of hinted that there was a relationship there. And the actress that they choose to play his love interest in this one, they went out of their way to give her a bearing resemblance to this woman from the satellite scene in the earlier movie. Well, newer, you know what I mean. It's an
Yeah.
earlier movie, but it's later in the timeline. And so like, it was just kind of nice to see. It's like, oh, well, are we finally going to get the story of what made him become, I guess, this agent-like person? And I mean, we do get that eventually, but it was nice to, see him sitting there with the picnic at night and they're stargazing and there's shooting stars, or what we are led to believe are shooting stars.
And I like that they got Elizabeth Winstead to play the love interest, who, like, in this movie, they give her a name, and that name, which is so hard for me to take seriously now, is Martha. Like, for obvious reasons, it's hard for me to take it seriously. But yeah, I do like how they made her look like she could eventually grow up to look like how she looks in that one moment in the 97 Men in Black movie. With the shooting stars, like you mentioned, like obviously they're like looking at it and making a wish or whatever and saying like some lovey-dovey stuff like I wish at this moment with you could last forever type of thing. The camera like zooms in on the shooting stars and shows that it's actually these, what we learn are the Balshans, like these tall gray aliens. They're sort of like crash landing somewhere. And so like at Men in Black headquarters, they really want to go and investigate this. And it takes them some time to locate them and get to where they are, which is why by the time that this whole thing happens, it's like the next date that Kevin means to go on, like delivering flowers and stuff. Like, what do you think of how all this stuff goes down?
I thought it was amazing that they were able to maintain the continuity between the films. And because, like, so he's driving down the road to take these flowers to his love interest girlfriend. I don't know if they were engaged at this point or not. I think he may have. No, yeah, he was going to propose that day, I believe, if I remember properly.
Yeah.
And then we get, it was raining and like, of course, we learned earlier in the movie that he likes to race his cars and he's driving kind of fast. It's the rain, so he kind of veers off the path, hits a wet spot, and just kind of winds up in this environment surrounded by these 3 or 4 Balshans, and he just happens to be there whenever the government agency shows up. But it's before they have the technology for the neuralizer, so instead of wiping his memory, they're like, well, let's just bring him in. What's the worst that can happen? And they end up getting possibly one of, if not the best agent that the Men in Black has ever had.
I quite like how the context that his arrival provides. Like, they depict the government officials here, like, they kind of don't know what they're doing. They're sort of just grasping at straws to the point where all their nervous actions when they like meet these aliens, like these officials kind of look like they could be threatening, and so the Balshans get like really nervous, and so things look like they're about to escalate. But with the arrival of Kevin with the flowers, it's very, I guess flowers are kind of the universal symbol of, like, especially if there's some on the Balshans planet, like they recognize that this represents peace and life, like stuff that grows when there's nothing, like no war affecting the ground or whatever, no battles trampling on this life that came out of the soil. And so I really loved how this went down, and the Baltians don't look too bad. The main one was actually played by Doug Jones, who's known for doing like creature costume work. So now, what did you think of how the Baltians looked here?
I thought it was great. You can tell that they went back and looked at that scene, and it wasn't a perfect reproduction in any means. Finally get to see it, and they're a little bit taller than he saw. But yeah, overall, I thought the costuming department did a really good job on creating these tall, gray alien creatures.
Yeah, how they bring him in and sort of debrief him on like everything that's gone on, and how they're like, well, you're part of this now. We can't just let you go. He's sort of just like still taking it in. Like he just met aliens. Like he's very like wide-eyed and just in awe, and sort of like it's hard for him to focus when they're talking to him. And like you really see the wonder in his eyes, which again is a contrast from how I'm used to thinking of this character when we see him in like later in his life. And he's just like really excited to be part of this whole thing, like meeting aliens. And he has like a very making peace sort of outlook here, which is funny when like later on he actually has to deal with more serious stuff and like stopping aliens who do bad things. So like it's sort of like a realization, a shock to the system here that like, you know, he has to make all these decisions. And here he's also like, he wants to like tell Martha about all this, but he also has like a dilemma in that he's not allowed to tell anyone about this.
Kind of interesting because, in the other MIB movies, whenever they recruit a new agent, they give them the whole spiel of you will conform to the identity that we give you, et cetera, et cetera. And this one, we don't get that because they're a fairly new organization and they're still ironing things out. How do we do this? It's like, he's like, yeah, I'll help you. He doesn't realize whenever he's like, I'll help you, he hasn't realized yet that he has to say goodbye to Martha and the whole life that he has known. And so it was interesting just to see how this character handles that for the first time, which also leads into why he takes such a keen interest in making sure that the new recruits that he goes and gets in the future, he lets them know, hey, it's worth it, but you have to say goodbye to everything that you know.
He has this dilemma because of all this. Because after this, he has to go to Martha, and she's like, I waited for you. What took you so long? And he's like, I had a reason of that I was late. Like, you just have to trust me on this. And you can tell that she's like really upset and can tell that he's hiding something, which is why he brings out the ring and sort of tries to use that to cover his tracks and prevent more questions from being asked. But even with this engagement and what it leads to and all of it, it's just like, as the audience, you know that this can't last and it's going to be like very heartbreaking. Like they want to get married really fast, but we know that the relationship is not going to last that long because of the MIB mythology.
Yeah, like he was kind of hoping that, or at least the way I saw it, which I could be wrong, and the way that the directors and everything were wanting it, but it seemed like he was already going to propose and everything to Martha, but then being inducted into the MIB, he was thinking that, well, if I propose and we get married, maybe I can clue her in on this stuff and then I don't have to lose her. And unfortunately, that's not how they operate.
Yeah, he kind of gets a scolding at by the officials. They're like, no, you cannot, like, you have to cut all ties and you can't let her know about all this. It's too dangerous. And he gets like really upset and yells at the officials. And that's when we get like, you know, super emotional Agent K is just like, unhinged and going all out, flipping tables. It's just like this movie really is going out of its way to show a different Agent K.
Yeah, and it answers a lot of questions at the same time. At least like questions that I had about like, well, how did they handle stuff like this happening? Because they never really touch on it. They normally always just explain it with all the answers you're looking for are right here. Look in this little device. Meanwhile, everyone's got sunglasses on, which I get it for a movie. That's a great way to, cover your tracks and just explain it away. But then in this movie, they actually take the time and show you this is why we do it this way. Because of people like Agent K, who, yeah, he's a great agent, but before he was an agent, he was very similar to Jay in a sense of I'm doing things my way.
You see that they're trying to work on a neuralizer type of device. So we get like the earliest known version of it. Like, what do you think of how it looks here?
So I thought at first I was really confused by it because it looked nothing like a modern neuralizer.
Right.
It actually looked more like the deneuralizer, where it was like, okay, we need you to come with us, sit in this chair, and just don't move. And then they eventually, I don't remember which alien race it is that actually gave them the technology for it, but eventually, by the end of the movie, we have progressed to the version of the neuralizer that we see in MIB3, where they have the battery pack and everything. So it's nice to see the evolution of the technology also, and not just the evolution of the organization and the characters.
Yeah, for sure. So he eventually has that confrontation with Martha. It's kind of when they're playing chess with each other. So I don't know if that was supposed to be like a metaphor or something, but maybe it was just something for them to do while they have this big moment. But he basically says that like if anything ever happens, he'd miss her. And she gets like really concerned, but again, she like he can't tell her anything. But what happens is eventually like what we hear in like later movies in the chronology, which is that the cover story is that like he's in a coma, and like that's why like it's basically why they're not together from like this point onward. And it's just really heartbreaking for him to the point where he just buries himself in his work, as we see in like this montage that keeps going like a few more years into the 60s. I think like they're not very clear on like when it is, but it seems very clear that it's like at least a few years into the decade. Like he looks like he's aging quite a bit, but yeah, he's just like really buried in his work and more stoic, like kind of more like the Agent K that we know.
Yeah, and also, with the traveling through the decade that they do and showing the progression, it's really nice to see. He starts off being lovey-dovey with this woman, Martha, and eventually a few scenes later, I guess a few years later, they introduce Agent O
Yeah.
also, and he kind of gets that spark again to be like, oh, well, you remind me of someone I used to know, and we get the whole expansion of their relationship at the same time.
Yeah, and Agent O, of course, is played by Alice Eve, who would play her in MIB3. And what's kind of funny is, I brought up the newer Star Trek movies earlier, but she would also go on to play a younger Carol Marcus in Star Trek Into Darkness. So it's kind of funny that she's been in not just one of these types of movies. Just a slight tangent. I thought she was a really great choice, and like Emma Thompson as well. Like I can believe that they're the same person. Like she'd grow into her, or she grew from her, or whatever. And it's just really good casting all around.
Probably one of the best multi-castings for a character. for younger and older, probably like one of the most believable versions of this character grows into that character.
Yeah, and Josh Brolin into Tommy Lee Jones as well. Like by the time he gets more stoic, it's like, okay, yeah, this is a young Tommy Lee Jones. I can believe it. Yeah. So he does feel the spark again, like with Agent O. Like they have some, like, they'll do like normal work stuff and try to be very matter of fact, but it's clear that they're really into each other and maybe flirting without flirting, if that makes sense. But he also feels kind of guilty because it's like he's thinking Martha and I are a thing. I should be with her and not feeling these feelings. But he also like tries to rationalize like, well, if I'm technically dead, like, does this count as being unfaithful? And he really has like an identity crisis here.
Yeah, and they handled it very well, I think, because I mean, they never show any like actual flirting. It's always just hinted at in their conversation where you can see this mutual attraction, but because of the rules and regulations in place, they can't act on them. And then he also has this emotional connection still with Martha, so he also doesn't want to act on it there. So you can really see that, it's pulling at his heartstrings and he doesn't know what to do about it.
Yeah, like in these moments, you get like really sad sounding 60s music. It's just like it does sound kind of funny to me, but it can also tug at the heartstrings no matter the song choice. Like, I think the what's going on in the story helps me take it more seriously because it's like, oh man, we saw this guy like over time, he's just been getting beaten down. It's kind of like how they tried handling Han Solo like later on in Solo, a Star Wars story. He was more adventurous and more optimistic and kind of Luke Skywalker like at the start, but then like over the course of that movie, he would become beaten down because of like all the stuff happened with Kira and the heartbreak there. So I kind of see like a similar trend in this movie. Like he's just Agent K is processing all these different feelings and it's really taking a toll on him.
Yeah, and then I do like also, since we're kind of still on the topic of Agent O, because they have to work together for a little bit. Well, they don't have to, they choose to for obvious reasons. But we get to see, I guess you could say, this timeline's version of the events that take place in the future movie MIB3. So we kind of get to see some small snippets of him going after, I just forgot his name, but the main villain from MIB3. We get to see the original timeline version. So instead of J and K going to Florida and Cape Canaveral and all that, it's K and O going to handle this situation. And just all of those scenes also just help solidify that relationship that those two characters had together.
Yeah, and it kind of makes Men in Black 3 feel more like Back to the Future Part 2 because we see some of those familiar scenes that revisit that stuff. And I really liked how like it built off of this movie and again like Agent O and Agent K. Oh wow, I just realized it's like OK. But I don't know if
Yeah,
that's
I was thinking of it the other way where it was KO, like knockout.
oh yeah like in,
So either way it works. OK or KO, take your pick.
yeah. Yeah, like KO, like in Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat or wherever it's from. Or just boxing in general. Like I know it's not just from video games, but yeah, like as they're doing all this stuff, like you can tell that they really are into each other and want to like they sort of are together for a while, but then realize, you know what, this can't get in the way of our work type of thing. And so it's like it's really wild how like Agent K has all these romances and like later like in the late 70s there's the Lorena stuff. And so it's like, even though we think of him as being really stoic and stern, like I guess people find him like really attractive. It's really funny.
I mean, I can see it though, because I mean, people do enjoy someone in a uniform of some sense, and then he carries himself very well, and he's learned very quickly how to communicate with these alien life forms, so they're going to love him, and some end up actually loving him.
Yeah, and it also helps that people, at least from what I can tell, really love Josh Brolin. Like just how he looks, I guess. Even when he's a purple alien, maybe. I don't know. Like in Avengers, obviously, but yeah.
I was like, wait, was there a scene that I went to the bathroom on that he was but then I was like, oh yeah, yeah, Avengers.
Yeah, Thanos. No, but yeah, I really like how they show how he handles all the alien stuff and sort of making these decisions of how to catch the ones that are doing bad things and how to help the ones that are just looking for a home and trying to find their place in this Earth society, I guess you could say. And just how the MIB itself evolves and he evolves with it. It's just like I didn't realize how necessary, I guess, like in air quotes, this movie ended up being. Like it's essential Men in Black viewing. It's just so well done as a prequel.
Yeah, because it really shows us, instead of, because in the first ones we get to see, headquarters where, oh yeah, there's a bunch of aliens that live on Earth, but we never see how they decide which ones can stay and which ones are deemed a threat. But we get to see how all of that kind of comes to fruition in this movie, which was amazing. That, they have this little side interview room where, they treat them with respect. They try to feed them some food and just have a simple conversation while they decide, well, do we want you to stay on this planet, or are we going to send you off to space again and find somewhere else?
Yeah, and just going through all these different bits of like soundtrack, like going from Elvis to the Beatles, and then I think it was like when they got to the 70s, it was like Led Zeppelin, and just it's like, wow, this movie really goes through it really covers a lot and has a lot packed into it, but it somehow doesn't feel like too much to me. Like it's kind of weird how that feels.
Yeah, I mean, they did a great job, because they always say, oh, most of them are in New York, but in this one we see, well, if they're not in New York, they're probably in Seattle,
Right,
which
yeah.
is, it's like, okay, yeah, so one coast versus the other, one's kind of, you know, very far, like straight to the east, and then you've got one up in the northwest, which is near the boundaries of countries, and just seeing everything that they do. We don't spend much time in Seattle, but just being able to not spend all this time in New York was amazing at the same time.
Yeah, I quite liked that little Seattle side plot. Like, it's how people would typically imagine Seattle. It's like windy and rainy, but when he goes to a coffee shop, like I could tell that they tried making the coffee shop look like the one from Frasier, which that show takes place in Seattle, and so during that, I kind of felt at home during that particular scene. Like it just felt very cozy. Like he's just sitting down and drinking coffee, and it's like all you need is the live studio audience, and it's like Frasier vibes.
Yeah, I didn't make those Frasier connections. I kind of forgot that Frasier happened in Seattle.
You know that Paramount are planning on like doing a Frasier revival of some sort.
Oh, I I didn't know that. I wondered how it will do.
Yeah, apparently it's going to be on Paramount Plus at some point. I have no idea how they're going to do it. If I were in charge of it, I would just not make it a sitcom and make it full on surrealism. Like Frasier is some supernatural psychiatrist who can go into people's minds and help fix their problems. But I'm just wild like that. I know that's not what the show's gonna be, probably. But it should be interesting, I guess. Like, I'll check it out. And who knows, maybe since iCarly takes place in Seattle, they could finally do a crossover. I don't know.
That would be an amazing crossover. Get the radio host to guest on the have like the old radio host with like the new podcaster
Oh
and
yeah,
have like the
webcaster.
comparisons.
Yeah, it would make sense, like having like they're both kind of like popular like talk personalities. So I'm sure someone could come up with a plot for like why they would broadcast together. So I'd be down for it, even on the off chance that it might be too goofy. It just would be totally worth it, I think.
I'd watch it.
Yeah. But yeah, getting back to MIB Declassified, what'd you think of how the rest of this movie played out?
I was always waiting to see what like the big issue that would arise that they have to overcome. You know, in every movie, there's always the villain or just whatever it is. And so this whole time I was sitting there waiting, and then I don't know, like the way that they bring about what it is, I'm not sure if I liked it. I'm still debating on if I did or not. What did you think about it?
They revealed that there was this alien that's very it kind of looks like it's made of spaghetti, and it talks about how it was there behind the scenes watching the Men in Black organization form, and we get like some quick flashbacks to like it's like hiding under a desk or like inside of a closet or whatever, and just watching how everything is transpiring, sort of taking notes and stuff and trying to plan some sort of invasion. And he confronts Agent K and is like, "You are a sad shell of what you used to be." And it's like this very heartbreaking moment. You can tell that the statement hits him, even if he's trying not to show it on his face, because he's so used to putting up a poker face by this point. But yeah, it's a really odd choice, and it kind of felt like it came out of left field, really.
But then, you know, with it being the spaghetti monster, I guess you could say it. Well, I guess spaghetti alien. It
Yeah.
does kind of add to the credibility of, you know, the common folklore of the spaghetti monster, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
that, you know, people see discussed in Reddit forums and all that. So it's kind of like a nice little, oh, yeah, we're going to include these pop culture references that not everyone's going to get, but everyone's still going to enjoy.
Right, yeah. Like the spaghetti alien is so weird. Like it even has like instead of eyeballs, they look like meatballs that you can somehow see through, and it's like I don't know if this is what he's actually made of or if it's like he's taken spaghetti and like used it as his form or whatever. They're not really clear on it, but just the overall design is kind of bizarre. But yeah, I'm not really sure how he stacks up as a threat compared to some of the other ones we've seen in other movies. But of course, we do know that Agent K and Agent O and company have to end up saving the day, which they do. You know, they are able to stop an invasion from destroying the Earth, basically, because, you know, it's Men in Black and that's what has to happen. Like, I guess I was more enjoying the not so much the save the world aspect of this story, but the how do these characters change type of story. Like I was more connected to like the human emotion aspect of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm kind of feel the same way. Like it was one of the few movies that I wasn't wanting there to be like a major threat because I was just enjoying the character exploration of how we get from point A to point B of, you know, character evolution essentially. And so whenever they did finally introduce the spaghetti monster, I was a little off put. I keep saying monster. I'm sorry. I know it's an alien, but But just like finally getting, whenever they finally introduced that, I was like, oh, okay, so we're gonna have a big fight at the end and everything. And even then, it wasn't a big fight. They ended up they're like, oh yeah, I challenged you to a game, and whoever wins wins. And I thought that was a really interesting take on the big finale that they choose to do.
Yeah, and the game that they end up playing is Monopoly, which many people get frustrated with. And so obviously Agent K knew this. And so they play this game, and Agent K is very patient with it, but the spaghetti alien is very impatient with it, to the point where he doesn't want to finish the game and just flips the board and gives up. And Agent K says that on a technicality, that means that you lose.
Yeah, and at that point, I was expecting violence to break out, but instead, the spaghetti alien, hey, I said it right this time.
Yeah.
The spaghetti alien, he actually, he honors the agreement, which I thought was very interesting. I was not expecting that, but I appreciated it.
Yeah, I guess it's a custom with his people. Like, as much as they want to invade, they still have a code of honor of sorts. I thought that was a very creative, if strange, way to go about it, but it's definitely memorable, if anything. Like, I guess that's at least it's memorable, like in a not so bad way. I guess it's kind of neutral for me, and I also quite like how toward the end of the movie, we've gone through all this stuff that he deals with, like, over these time periods, and then he's driving around and is driving cautiously and not too fast, on just it's just normal traffic. And then, like, out his window, he sees that Martha is, like, sitting on a bench, and you can tell that he wishes that he could talk to her, but he knows that he can't, and so he has to, like, drive away. But yeah, what did you think of that moment?
I thought it was a beautiful moment because throughout the whole movie, we see the growth of Agent K going from being Kevin to being Agent K. And it all kind of comes to fruition in this moment because you see him, he's driving the speed limit. He's not driving as reckless as he was before. So you get to see him, he's learned, he's grown. He stops and he looks over, and you're like, oh, is this going to be the moment where he snaps and chooses, I'm done with this? Which we know that's not the case because it's a prequel and we know he's still an agent. But it was just really nice to see, him fully reaching the character that we know him has by that point.
He's a character who goes through all these different relationships with Martha and O and Lorena, and I don't know if you feel this way as well, but to me it kind of felt ambiguous, still, that because they're not as specific about it, but it still feels ambiguous to me that Laura from MIB2, like, whether or not that's his daughter. But I don't know, like, what do you think of that subject?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question because I know they don't explore the Lorana story too much. We really just get the retelling of that one scene and some of the fallout from it, but we don't see too much Lorana in this movie. But I've always felt, at least, that Laura was the offspring of Lorana and Agent K, and I would have liked a little bit more on that, but at the same time, I understand why they couldn't devote so much time to that story.
Yeah, it kind of feels like they tacked that portion on, and it's honestly like it's one of the not so strong points for me. Like, that's the one thing where it felt like they were trying to cram in everything when maybe they shouldn't have. But other than that, like, I feel like they handled a lot of all this other stuff pretty well. So before we close out, was there anything else you want to say? Like, I don't know if there's, like, anything about the music or what.
The post-credit scene, which I felt was around that time frame, 2008, post-credit scenes were not a very common thing to have. And so I always stick through all the way to the end anyways, just because I like to pay respect to the people that worked on the film.
Right.
And so getting to see this scene where Agent O gets called in to the higher up's office and they tell her, "Hey, you're being reassigned to another office." And uh, she gets sent back to Seattle to work in an office there, which I thought was a really nice way to explain why she was not in MIB 1 and 2. And then, they tell her something along the lines of, "We need you to spend a decade there training this new office. We'll call you back when we can, but we really need someone of your expertise to help these new people," which I thought was just an amazing way of explaining that away, tying up all loose ends, continuity errors that people could call out.
Yeah, because in 2008, like Iron Man also came out that year, and that sort of like even though we'd gotten movies with post-credit scenes before, like X-Men 3, for example, like Iron Man was what was what blew up the trend even further, and many superhero or like genre movies since then have had post-credit scenes. But whereas those would for the most part be sequel bait, this did feel like it was more just to clarify continuity stuff, which on one hand feels very neat and tidy, but on the other hand, it kind of feels like they sort of tacked that on, like just because, and maybe it didn't need to be there. But in either case, it's a harmless scene, I guess. And so, like overall, how do you think this compares to other prequels, like in general?
Compared to other prequels, I feel like this one does a very good job. I would put it up there with the Star Wars prequels, which I know there's plenty of people out there that have their discourse about those films as well. I personally am not one of those people. I appreciate the prequels for everything that they gave us in Star Wars. And so, on the same tone, I really appreciate this movie for what it does with the Men in Black universe. And it fills in so many holes in, what was it, like an hour and 45 or something like that, or 2 hours, somewhere around there. And so the amount that they were able to give us in that time frame, I thought was just amazing.
Yeah, for me, my favorite Star Wars prequels are Revenge of the Sith, Solo, and Rogue One. Not necessarily in that order, but I'd put MIB Declassified up with those, and X-Men First Class as well. And maybe the 2009 Star Trek would be around there as well, even though it's not technically a prequel since it's a new timeline. But I feel like people know what I mean.
Yeah.
But yeah, overall, I guess we could go into final thoughts and score out of 10, and have measurement for those scores. So, what are your final thoughts, scored out of 10, and have measurement for MIB Declassified?
So as soon as I heard that this movie was coming out, and I want to say it got announced whenever I was 15 or something like that, and then a couple years to make it and all that. As soon as I heard about it, I was on board with this movie, because I was one of those people that as I watch these movies, I'm immediately raising questions for, well, how come this works and how come that doesn't? And this movie explained it all, or most of it all, perfectly. And then it met all those expectations as well. So I'm probably going to give it like 9 out of 10 queens off a chessboard.
Nice. Yeah, I think I'm gonna give it the same score because I really enjoyed this movie. It's really high up there for me in terms of Men in Black movies. Like the third one is really high up there for me. Well, the third in that Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones series is high up for me, and so this one having the stuff that sort of is the impetus for what happens in that movie, but also explains a lot of this backstory, and for the most part not doing it in a way where it feels like just a checklist. Like they inject life into the checklist items for the most part. It's just like toward the end, some of it feels kind of rushed and cobbled together, which is hence why it's not a 10. So yeah, I give MIB Declassified 9 out of 10 spaghetti noodles. So yeah, I think that'll do it. Thanks for joining me again, Jesse. Where can people find you and question possible answer?
Thanks again for having me. It's been wonderful discussion as always. So people can find question possible answer on Facebook and Instagram. Just type in your search bar the same name, question possible answer. That's where you'll find our release schedule and where you can add insight to where you would like to see in our episodes. At the time of this release, I believe the episode that will be out at that time frame will be a Jurassic Park: The Lost World discussion with Zach Arnold from the Intergalactic Peace Coalition. You can find the podcast on Anchor and anywhere else where you listen to your podcasts.
Nice. Yeah, and that's anchor.fm/question dash possible dash answer. And I'll link it in the show notes as well as usual. But
I like that you know the link to my podcast more than I do. I just know it's on anchor.fm.
yeah, I mean, if in general, if someone uploads a podcast on there, it's either their name with a dash between the names, or it's their podcast name with the dash between each word. Like that's just how it works.
Okay, yeah, I know it's question possible answer. I just never remember if there's dashes or not.
Right. But yeah, so that's all Jesse's stuff. And as for me, people can follow me at Steven Shinder on Instagram and Twitter, Steven Shinder Storytelling on Facebook. You can find my fantasy horror comedy novel Lemons in My Grain on Amazon. More info at stevenshinder.com. And the next book, Trespassing Through the Visages, I'm trying to get out by the end of this year. It also has aliens, funny enough. So yeah, kind of sci-fi alien stuff, kind of similar to Men in Black, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, and you can also find. I recently guested on my friends Dylan and Keon's podcast, Trust Your Doctor, Doctor Who podcast. We talked about the audio Doctor Who, The Spectre of Lanyon Moore. So that's an early Big Finish audio from like the year 2000. It's like their 9th one, I think. And it features the 6th Doctor and the Brig. So yeah, a cool story for the most part. And you can also email Delayed Replay at delayedreplaypodcast@gmail.com. Let us know your thoughts on, I don't know, aliens or something. And you can also find me on Yesshift, a podcast and vlog that I do with my dad. We talk about the progressive rock band Yes, as well as people who like past and former or current members. We've had a few of them on our show and interviewed them, and we've also had a few other people who've like worked with the band or with members of the band. So yeah, go ahead and check that out. The audio is on Anchor and on various podcast platforms. And you can watch the video on Facebook whenever we go live there, or you can find the YouTube channel. And I'll link those in the description and the show notes. And yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. I think the next episode will we'll be going back to talking about more current and recent movies from this universe, but I'm sure at some point down the line we'll return to these Men in Black movies that aren't in that other universe. But without further delay, have a good day.